Hi guys, and welcome back. In this session we're going to be looking at compressors. So a compressor is a tool that we use to control the dynamic range of our source. So we have RMS and peak. RMS is our continuous level. Peak is our initial transient, or the loudest part in our sound wave. So we use compressors to attenuate the difference between those peak transients and the RMS continuous volume. So what that does to the sound is it actually means that we have a much more even sound. It means that the quieter parts of our mix are actually brought up to almost the same level as our peaks. So for example, if we have a snare drum and we have big hits followed by little ghost notes, we're effectively going to bring up the sound of those little ghost notes by turning down our big hit and then turning the whole thing up. And so what we end up with is much less difference between those quiet hits and the big one. So this is really handy because there's lots of times that in a mix, when we've got everything going on, all the really detailed parts just get lost, and we're able to bring those up by reducing that dynamic range. So let's jump into Logic and I'll show you how a compressor works. So we're in Logic now, and I've got our shaker track soloed here. We can see from the transient waveforms here that we've got some very strong hits that are on the beats and some quieter notes in between. So let's just take a listen to the shaker. Now it might be that in the mix we're actually, these quieter notes are getting lost, and so what we want to do is have the effect of turning these notes up. So that we get a nice rhythm that cuts through the entire mix. And to do that, we're going to use a compressor. So I have already got some settings dialed in here, and I'll start playing the shaker track without the compressor and then engage it. And what you should hear is all of those quieter notes get a bit louder. So there you go, with the compression on, it's bringing up those quieter notes. Now you'll also hear that it's bringing up a little bit more of the noise floor of the mic that was used to record, and also you're getting a little bit more of the bleed from the metronome in the headphones of the person that was playing the shaker. Now obviously this isn't going to be a problem if you're working on things like MIDI, but you might find with certain microphones that you do start to bring up unwanted noises that are in the recording as well. So you need to kind of get the right balance between making the dynamic range where you want it to be and also not starting to bring up unwanted noise. Now let's go back to opening this compressor, and I'll go through the settings that I've dialed in and why I've done it and what all the controls are doing. Let's start off over here. This is our input gain. So you can hit the compressor a little bit harder by turning this up, or you can hit it a bit softer by turning it down. I've just left it as it is because it's the volume that I've recorded it at, and that's just, makes sense for me. But it might be that if I've got a quiet source that I need to just turn that input gain up to get a bit more of a stronger signal to come into the compressor. Now next we've got our threshold, and this is basically the decibel area that we're going to actually start reacting to. So the compressor is not going to compress anything until it goes above minus 43 decibels. Over here we have our ratio, and this is going to be how many decibels are going to be attenuated or turned down for every decibel over this threshold. So currently I've got this at 2 to 1. So for every 2 decibels over this threshold of minus 43, it's going to be turned down by 1 decibel. Next we've got our makeup gain, and this is basically after we've turned down those peaks, we want to turn up the whole track just to kind of get the level to be about where it was originally, where those original transients were. And this basically has the effect of turning up those quieter notes to be a similar volume to our louder notes. At the bottom here we have our knee. Basically this is kind of the curve or shape of the compressor, so you can kind of smooth things out or make things a bit harsher with this control. Next to that we have our attack. So we've set our threshold and our ratio, and basically this is the amount of time that it's going to take before the compression is going to start reacting. So as soon as we've gone over our threshold of -43, we're going to wait 2.5 milliseconds before the compressor is going to start being affected. Now the reason I've left this to be 2.5 milliseconds is just to let a little bit of that initial transient attack still come through, so it still has that pulse and it sounds kind of natural. Next to that, we've got our release, and this is how long the compression is going to sort of tail off for. It's going to roll off kind of slowly. And I've just, again, put this to 77 milliseconds, which is just shy of a second. And it just means that it's going to kind of tail off naturally, and it won't hang around for too long. So there's our basic compression settings. Now, over on the far right, we actually have a limiter section. Now, a limiter is kind of like a compressor, and not all compression plugins are going to have limiters on them. This is almost a separate plugin in itself, and we're going to go into more detail on limiting when we look at mastering. But for now, it's basically just, rather than pulling down our transients, we set a threshold and turn the volume up, and it's basically going to not allow anything to go above a certain threshold. It'll just chop the top off everything. So once again, we'll just play it with it bypassed and engaged it again, and you can take a listen to how it sounds. So now let's take a look at some other ways of applying some compression. Now I'm going to use a function over here called sidechain, and I'm going to do this on the bass track. So let's find our bass track now. Here we have our two bass tracks. We've got our clean DI and our affected drive bass sound. Now I've got the outputs of both of these set to come to a bus, which I've called the bass bus. And on this one, I'm going to apply a compressor. Now, this is where we use our sidechain input. Now, what I've done is I've set this to come from our kick channel, which is on audio 4. What this is going to do is, rather than setting a certain sort of threshold trigger, it's going to only start compressing when it receives a signal from this sidechain input. So essentially what I've managed to do here is set our kick drum to trigger the compressor. Now, the reason for doing this is that you want to make sure that the kick always stays nice and punchy in a mix, and because the bass is going to be taking up a lot of the same sort of frequency areas as a kick drum, we want to kind of just duck the bass out a little bit every time that kick happens, just to make space for the kick drum to breathe. So I've got a sort of slow release time, so we've got plenty of time for the kick drum to decay. We've got a reasonably fast attack, but not completely fast, so that we can still get that initial kind of finger sound. And I'm turning it down by a fair amount, just to kind of make sure that there's plenty of volume dip for the kick drum to breathe through. So let's take a listen to the bass with the compressor bypassed. Okay, and now I'm going to put the compressor on. Now you can see the needle is kind of moving, and it doesn't really make much sense why it's moving or why the compressor's working at this moment. So now what I'm going to do is solo the kick drum, and we'll listen to the bass without the sidechain compressor working, and we'll hear how the two are sitting together. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage our compressor so that the bass ducks out when those kicks are hit, and we should hear that the kick drum starts to get a bit more punchy, and it just kind of sits in the mix a bit easier and has enough space to breathe. Now, it's quite a subtle thing. So now what I've done is I've just adjusted the settings here to exaggerate this. Now, obviously, we wouldn't want to kind of use such drastic settings, but just to give you a clearer idea of exactly what's happening to our bass, I've made the attack time much quicker. I've adjusted the ratio and the threshold so that now we're getting much more gain reduction on the bass when the kick drums are being hit. I'm going to bypass this and we'll listen to the kick and the bass, and then I'll engage our sidechain compression. So you can hear there that the compression is now really ducking out that bass, and that's taking its signal from our sidechain. So that's a really, really useful tool to use compression for, and it helps keep headroom in the mix and clear things up. So there you go. That's how you use a compressor. It's a really useful tool. You want to make sure that you don't use this or rely on it to actually create your mix by just leveling the whole thing out. Your mix needs to come from your faders and your automation, and we'll get onto that later. If you slam a compressor, it does get a really cool sound, and it can be a really good effect. But if you start relying on it to do the mix for you, you're only going to end up with a mix that you don't like. Be kind of gentle with it unless you're going to use it for an effect for a certain part. So have a go, get creative, have a play with compressors, and I'll see you guys in the next one.